The iron beast hissed and groaned on the tracks, expelling great plumes of white steam that curled into the cloudless azure sky above the platform. Mei Ling stood amidst the swirling vapor, her small, gloved hands clutching a leather valise that contained everything she possessed in this world. The heat of the late spring afternoon was oppressive, radiating off the wooden planks of the station platform and pressing against the black silk of her mourning dress. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, a vertigo that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the ticket tucked securely inside her sleeve. It was a one-way passage back east, back to the crowded tenements and the judgmental eyes of her late husband's business associates, back to a life where she would be nothing more than a curiosity, a widow without standing. The conductor pulled his pocket watch, the gold catching the harsh sunlight, and shouted the final call for boarding. The vibration of the engine thrummed through the soles of her boots, urging her forward, yet her feet felt heavy, rooted to the dusty floorboards of this frontier outpost. She took a step toward the metal stairs, the dark cavern of the passenger car yawning open to swallow her whole, when the thunder of hooves broke through the rhythmic chugging of the locomotive. A horse, its coat slick with sweat and foam, skidded to a halt at the edge of the platform, kicking up a spray of dry earth. The rider vaulted from the saddle before the beast had fully stopped, his boots hitting the wood with a heavy, purposeful thud. It was Henry. He looked wilder than she had ever seen him, his hat pushed back to reveal a forehead streaked with dust, his chest heaving from the exertion of the ride. He did not shout, for Henry was not a man given to loud displays, but his presence was a physical barrier between her and the train. He walked toward her, ignoring the conductor's irritated gestures, his eyes locked onto hers with a terrifying intensity. "Mei Ling," he said, his voice rough with grit and emotion. He did not reach out to grab her. He stopped a respectful distance away, removing his hat and crumpling the brim in his large, calloused hands. "Don't get on that train, please." The steam hissed louder, obscuring the faces of the other passengers peering out the windows, isolating the two of them in a suspended moment of consequence. Mei Ling felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "There is nothing for me here, Henry," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "My husband is gone. The mine has closed. I have no home." Henry shook his head, a slow, stubborn movement that denied her logic. "You have a place, if you want it," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if he had practiced them 1,000 times on the ride over. "I know it's too soon. I know I have no right to ask. But the ranch, it's too big for one man. It's too quiet. I'm asking you to stay. Not as a servant, not as anything you don't want to be." He took a step closer, the scent of sagebrush and horse sweat clinging to him, an earthy, honest smell that cut through the coal smoke. "Just give me a chance. Give the land a chance. One season. If come autumn you still want to leave, I'll buy the ticket myself. I'll drive you all the way to St. Louis if I have to. But don't leave because you think you have nowhere to go." The conductor blew the whistle, a shrill shriek that made Mei Ling flinch. She looked at the dark opening of the train car, then back at Henry's open, pleading face. In his eyes she saw not pity, but a profound, terrifying hope. The choice was a precipice: the safety of the known misery back east, or the terrifying freedom of the unknown west with this quiet, rugged man. She looked at his hands, hands that built fences and birthed calves, now held out, empty and waiting. With a breath she didn't realize she was holding, she turned her back on the train. The buckboard wagon rattled rhythmically over the rutted trail, the silence between them stretching out as wide and vast as the prairie that surrounded them. Henry had loaded her trunk with a reverence usually reserved for church relics, treating her meager possessions as if they were gold bullion. Now he sat beside her, holding the reins loosely, his eyes scanning the horizon where the purple bruise of the distant mountains met the endless blue of the sky. It was late afternoon and the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long golden shadows across the sea of grass that rippled in the wind like water. Mei Ling sat upright, her spine stiff against the wooden seat, acutely aware of the man beside her. She had made her choice, and now the reality of it was settling in with the dust that coated her travel clothes. She was a woman alone, riding into the wilderness with a man who was not her husband, in a country that barely tolerated her existence. Yet, as she watched Henry's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way he squinted against the glare without complaint, she felt a strange sense of safety that she had not experienced in years. He seemed to sense her scrutiny and cleared his throat, a rumble deep in his chest. "It's not a palace, Mei Ling," he said apologetically, keeping his eyes on the trail where a hawk was circling low over a patch of brush. "The house, I mean. My mother passed 5 years ago, and since then, well, a man living alone tends to let the softer things slide. It's sturdy, and the roof holds against the spring rains, but it's rough." Mei Ling looked at his hands on the leather reins, noting the strength and the gentleness in how he guided the team. "I do not need a palace, Henry," she answered softly. "I have lived in palaces of silk that were prisons, and I have lived in shacks that were filled with love. The structure does not matter as much as the spirit within it." Henry glanced at her then, a brief, shy look that softened the crinkles around his eyes. "Well, the spirit is willing," he admitted with a faint smile. "I tried to sweep before I rode out to catch you, but I reckon I missed the corners." As they crested a low rise, the ranch came into view. It sat nestled in a shallow valley, protected by a grove of cottonwood trees that shimmered in the breeze. The house was built of whitewashed timber, glowing pale orange in the dying light, surrounded by a constellation of barns and corrals. Cattle grazed in the middle distance, red and white specks against the greening earth. It was beautiful in a raw, untamed way, a place that demanded work but promised peace. Mei Ling felt a lump form in her throat. It was so open, so exposed to the elements, yet it stood defiant. Henry pulled the team to a halt in front of the porch, setting the brake with a metallic clang. He hopped down and came around to her side, reaching up to offer his hand. For a moment she hesitated. Taking his hand felt like sealing a contract, a physical acknowledgement of this strange new partnership. She placed her gloved hand in his warmth. His grip was firm, stabilizing her as she descended to the packed earth. "Welcome home, for as long as you want it to be," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that the wind nearly carried away. She looked at the house, then at him, and nodded. "Thank you, Henry," she said, and for the first time that day, the crushing weight of her grief felt just a fraction lighter. The first few weeks were defined by a quiet, rhythmic dance of labor and discovery. Mei Ling claimed the interior of the house not with force, but with a persistent, gentle tide of industry. She pulled down the heavy, dust-laden drapes that Henry had lived with for years, washing them in boiling water until they were crisp and clean, allowing the brilliant prairie sunlight to flood the rooms. The house, which had smelled of stale tobacco and old leather, began to smell of lemon balm, beeswax, and the savory, complex aromas of her cooking. She found a neglected plot of earth near the kitchen door, choked with weeds, and began the arduous task of turning the soil. It was back-breaking work, the earth resisting her spade, but she found a therapeutic release in the struggle. She planted seeds she had saved, vegetables and herbs that Henry had never heard of, alongside the rows of potatoes and corn he was used to. Henry, for his part, seemed to work with renewed vigor. He would leave before dawn, the coffee she brewed hot and strong in his stomach, and return at dusk, smelling of the herd and the honest sweat of the day. He was careful, painfully respectful of her space. He slept in the small bunk room off the barn for the first week, until Mei Ling firmly set a place for him at the head of the dining table and told him that a man should sleep in his own house. They ate dinner together every evening, the silence between them slowly filling with the small currencies of conversation. He told her about the water rights disputes and the new calf that had been born with a star on its forehead. She told him about the history of the silk trade and the poetry her father had taught her. One evening, after a particularly grueling day where a summer storm had threatened the herd, Henry watched her mend a tear in his work shirt by the light of the kerosene lamp. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice thick with fatigue. "I'm used to wearing them ragged." Mei Ling did not look up, her needle flashing like a silver fish in the lamplight. "A partnership requires maintenance, Henry. You mend the fences to keep the cattle safe. I mend the cloth to keep you respectable. It is a fair exchange." He watched her for a long time, the firelight dancing in his eyes, before whispering, "I'm getting the better end of the deal, I think." The true test of their arrangement came not from the land, but from the town. It was midsummer when the supplies ran low, and a trip to the general store became unavoidable. Henry harnessed the team, his face set in a grim expression. He knew what the town was like. He knew the narrow minds that congregated on the boardwalks. "You don't have to come," he told her as he checked the cinch on the horse. "I can bring back whatever list you write." Mei Ling adjusted her hat, checking her reflection in the small porch mirror. She had traded her mourning black for a simple calico dress she had sewn herself, blue as the cornflowers growing by the creek. "I am not a ghost, Henry. I will not hide in this valley." Her chin was lifted, her eyes defiant. Henry looked at her, pride swelling in his chest so sharply it almost hurt. "All right then," he said. "Let's go." The town was bustling with the midday trade. As they walked up the wooden steps of the general store, the conversation on the porch died instantly. Men stopped whittling. Women paused in their adjustments of bonnets. The silence was loud, filled with curiosity and thinly veiled hostility. They walked into the store, the bell above the door chiming cheerfully, a stark contrast to the atmosphere. The shopkeeper, a man named Mr. Henderson, who had known Henry for 20 years, looked from Henry to Mei Ling with a sneer curling his lip. "Didn't know you were hiring help, Henry," Henderson said, his voice dripping with insinuation as he wiped the counter with a dirty rag. "Though I suppose she's distinct looking enough." The air in the store grew frigid. Mei Ling stiffened, her hands clutching her reticule, preparing for the shame she had endured 1,000 times before. But before she could speak, Henry's hand came down on the counter, flat and hard. It wasn't a slam, but the weight of it shook the jar of penny candy. "You will speak with respect, Henderson," Henry said, his voice low, lacking any trace of his usual easy-going drawl. It was the voice of the man who broke wild horses and survived blizzards. "This is Mei Ling. She is my partner in the ranch. She is not help, and she is certainly not a topic for your amusement. You will address her as ma'am, and you will fill her order with the best stock you have, or I will take my trade, and the trade of every hand I employ, to the next county." The shopkeeper paled, shrinking back against the shelves of tinned goods. He looked at Henry's eyes, which were hard as flint, and swallowed nervously. "My apologies, ma'am," Henderson mumbled, looking down at his ledger. "No offense meant." Henry did not relax. He turned to Mei Ling, offering his arm with the courtly grace of a duke. "Shall we get your flour, Mei Ling?" She took his arm, feeling the tremor of adrenaline in his muscle. She looked up at him, and in that moment, amidst the smell of sawdust and dry goods, she realized she was not merely being sheltered, she was being cherished. "Yes, Henry," she said clearly, "we shall." By late August, the golden light of summer had deepened into the rich amber haze of early autumn. The evenings were cooling, the crickets singing a slower, more melancholy song in the tall grass. The season Henry had asked for was drawing to a close. They sat on the porch after supper, watching the fireflies blink in the cottonwoods. A comfortable silence settled between them, born of months of shared meals and shared labor. Henry was whittling a piece of soapstone, smoothing it with his thumb, while Mei Ling shelled peas into a metal bowl, the plink-plink sound marking the time. The question of her departure hung in the air, unsaid but heavy. Henry stopped his work and set the stone down on the railing. He turned to her, his face half in shadow. "The station master says the schedule changes next week," he began, his voice tight. "Trains running less frequent as the weather turns." Mei Ling stopped her hands. She looked out at the darkening hills, the landscape she had come to know as intimately as the lines on her own palm. "Is that so?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. Henry stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, leaning against the post. "I promised you a ticket," he said, staring out at the darkness. "I promised I wouldn't hold you past the season. If you want to go, I have the money set aside in the tin in the kitchen." He turned to face her, and the raw vulnerability on his face broke her heart. He looked like a man bracing for a physical blow. "But I have to say, this house has never been a home until you walked into it. And I don't want to go back to just existing. I want to live with you." Mei Ling set the bowl of peas on the floor and stood up, smoothing her apron. She walked to him, the floorboards creaking softly under her feet. She reached out and took his rough, calloused hand in hers, turning it over to trace the lines of his palm. "I have no desire to see the east again, Henry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I have planted a garden that needs harvesting. We have cattle that will need hay for the winter, and—" She looked up into his eyes, seeing the dawn of realization and joy breaking there. "And I find that my heart is no longer in a valise at a train station. It is here, with you." Henry let out a breath that sounded like a sob, his other hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. "You'll stay?" he asked, needing to hear it again. "I will stay," she promised. "Not for a season, but for a lifetime." He leaned down, and as their foreheads touched under the canopy of the vast, star-dusted western sky, the contract was sealed not with paper, but with the quiet, enduring promise of two souls finding anchor in the storm. The seasons turned like the slow, heavy wheel of a grist mill, grinding the tentative hope of their arrangement into the solid flour of a life built together. With the arrival of the following spring, the valley exploded into a riot of wildflowers, painting the hills in strokes of lupine purple and paintbrush red. It was during this season of renewal that the nature of their partnership shifted from implicit understanding to explicit commitment. Henry had spent weeks in a state of distracted anxiety, often pausing in his mending of the corral fences to stare at the house where Mei Ling moved past the windows. One warm evening, when the air was thick with the scent of blooming lilac, he came to her in the kitchen. He had scrubbed his face until it shone and donned his Sunday suit, which fit him a little tighter across the shoulders than it had years ago. Mei Ling was kneading dough, her hands dusted with white flour, her movements rhythmic and soothing. She stopped when she saw him, wiping her hands on her apron, sensing the gravity of the moment. Henry did not kneel. His knees were too stiff from years in the saddle for such theatrical gestures, but he stood straighter than she had ever seen him. He held out a small velvet box, his hand trembling slightly. "I am a man of few words, Mei Ling, and most of them are plain," Henry began, his voice clearing the silence of the room. "But I know that a man who finds a treasure and does not secure it is a fool. You have been the heart of this ranch for a year. I would like you to be the heart of my life for the rest of my days." He opened the box to reveal a ring, not of flashy diamond, but a band of gold inset with a polished piece of jade he had ordered all the way from San Francisco, knowing it was a stone of significance to her people. "I wrote to a merchant in the city," he explained bashfully. "He said this means protection and longevity. That is what I want to give you." Mei Ling looked at the ring, the green stone cool and deep like a river pool, and then at Henry's earnest, sun-weathered face. Tears pricked her eyes, not of sorrow, but of an overwhelming sense of belonging. "You offer me a home, and now you offer me your name," she whispered, stepping closer to him. "I would be honored to carry both, Henry." The wedding was a quiet affair held in the shade of the great cottonwoods 2 weeks later, attended only by the few neighbors who had come to respect Mei Ling's quiet strength and the minister who rode out from town. As they stood before the altar of the open sky, Henry took her hand, his grip firm and warm, and in that touch they sealed a covenant that was stronger than the timber of their house. Years flowed into decades, marked not by the calendar, but by the expansion of the herd and the graying of their hair. The ranch, once a lonely outpost, grew into a thriving enterprise, a testament to their combined will. They added a new wing to the house to accommodate the life that filled it, a nursery that eventually became a bedroom for their son Samuel. The boy had Henry's height and Mei Ling's dark, watchful eyes, a living bridge between their two worlds. Summer days were long and filled with the honest heat of labor. Mei Ling no longer wore the silks of the East, but practical cotton dresses that allowed her to work the garden and manage the accounts with equal dexterity. She and Henry moved around each other with the effortless choreography of a team that had memorized each other's rhythms. There was a romance in the work, a silent language of love spoken in the way Henry would ensure the water barrel was always full so she wouldn't have to pump it in the heat, or the way Mei Ling would have a cold compress and a glass of lemonade waiting on the porch when she saw him riding in from the south pasture, exhausted and coated in dust. One particularly scorching July afternoon, the air shimmering in waves off the baked earth, Henry sat heavily on the porch steps, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. Samuel, now a strapping teenager, was out checking the fence line. Mei Ling came out and sat beside Henry, not saying a word, simply resting her shoulder against his. The contact was grounding. Henry let out a long sigh, the tension of the drought worries leaving his frame. "We need rain, May," he murmured, squinting at the relentless blue sky. "The creek is getting low." Mei Ling took his hand, her skin now papery and marked by the sun, interlocking her fingers with his. "The rain will come, Henry. It always does. We have weathered dry spells before, and we have weathered storms. As long as the root is deep, the tree survives." She squeezed his hand. "Our roots are deep." Henry turned to look at her, and the look of adoration on his face was as fresh as the day he had stopped her at the train station. "You are the water in this valley, Mei Ling," he said softly. "I would be dust without you." He leaned over and kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss that tasted of salt and sweet tea, a reaffirmation of the passion that still burned quietly beneath the layers of domestic duty. It was a love that didn't need to shout. It was evident in the way they sat there for an hour, watching the horizon, content simply to be in the same space. As the wheel turned further, the frantic energy of building a legacy gave way to the peaceful stewardship of what they had created. Samuel had married a girl from the next county and taken over the heavy lifting of the ranch operations, allowing Henry and Mei Ling to retreat into the gentler rhythms of old age. The summers seemed hotter now, or perhaps their blood had just grown thinner, and they spent more time in the shade of the porch that Henry had built all those years ago. They had become an institution in the valley, the old couple who were always together, like two trees whose trunks had grown around each other until they were indistinguishable. Henry's walk had developed a hitch, a reminder of a bad fall from a horse in his 40s, and Mei Ling's eyesight was dimming, blurring the edges of the world. Yet they compensated for each other's failings with a grace that moved anyone who saw them. Mei Ling would read the newspaper aloud to Henry in the evenings, her voice raspy but steady, while Henry would guide her by the elbow over the uneven ground of the yard, acting as her eyes. One late afternoon, bathed in the amber glow of a setting sun that turned the prairie grass to gold, they sat in their rocking chairs, the creak-creak sound a familiar heartbeat. Henry reached over and rested his hand on hers. His knuckles were swollen with arthritis, his skin spotted like the back of a trout, but his touch was as gentle as ever. "I was thinking today," he said, his voice gravelly and slow, "about that day at the station, the noise of that steam engine. It still haunts me sometimes. How close I came to letting you go." Mei Ling turned her face toward him, her eyes milky but smiling. "But you didn't, Henry. You rode that horse until its heart nearly burst. You chose me." Henry nodded, a tear tracking through the deep fissures of his cheek. "Best ride of my life," he whispered. "I look at this, the boy, the land, you, and I feel like the richest man who ever lived. I wish I could stop the sun from going down. I'm not ready for the night to come." Mei Ling lifted his hand to her lips, kissing the rough skin. "The sun must set, my love, so that the stars can shine. We have had a long, beautiful day. We have no reason to fear the twilight." They sat there as the light faded to indigo, two silhouettes against the vastness of the west, holding on to the moment and to each other. The end came as they had always prayed it would, peacefully and without a long separation. Henry went first, passing in his sleep during a warm afternoon nap, his heart simply stopping like a clock that had run down its winding. Mei Ling did not weep with the hysteria of young grief. She mourned with the deep, hollow ache of an amputee. She organized the funeral with the same dignity she had carried all her life, standing by the grave under the cottonwood tree, a small, frail figure in black. She lingered there after the others had gone back to the house, touching the fresh earth. "Wait for me," she whispered to the wind. "Do not ride too far ahead." And he did not make her wait long. 6 weeks later, just as the first hint of autumn cooled the air, Mei Ling lay down in their bed and did not wake up. Samuel found her with a smile on her face, her hands clasped over her chest, clutching the jade ring Henry had given her. They buried her beside him, their headstones identical, 2 arches of granite facing the rising sun. Decades later, the valley had changed. Fences were wire instead of rail, and paved roads cut through the dust. But the ranch house still stood, sturdy and whitewashed, a testament to the hands that built it. Samuel's grandchildren ran through the tall grass where Henry had once broken horses, and they played in the shade of the massive cottonwoods that Mei Ling had loved. In the family graveyard, enclosed by a low stone wall, the 2 headstones had weathered, the names Henry and Mei Ling partially obscured by lichen. But the story remained. It was whispered by the locals, told to visitors as a legend of the county. It was the story of the rancher and the widow, of the train that wasn't taken, and the love that bloomed in the unlikely soil of the frontier. It was not a story of conquest or gold, but of a far greater treasure, the enduring, quiet power of a choice made for love. The wind still blew through the valley, carrying the scent of sage and history, singing the eternal song of a partnership that had conquered the loneliness of the West and left a legacy of hope fulfilled.